was the man who steered the planning commission. He was a trusted aide of former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and now he is the author himself. Joining me is Montek Singh Ahluwali. Thank you for joining us here at IANS, sir. Sir, you have come up with this book called Backstage. Give us a sense that what is the need for you to reflect upon what was the bygone years?
Well, I think when you say bygone years, it's sort of my story of how economic policy evolved. And it's very important, if you're interested in government, to know how things evolve in government. Many different people are involved in a process. Ideas get mulled around, then change comes. Everything doesn't work perfectly, but some changes do get made, and then they have an impact. So I wanted to give a person a sense that, I had the privilege of being a participant in this process pretty much from 1979 to 2014, with just a 3-year break in between when I went off to the IMF. And I'm trying to cover this whole period to give a sense of how policies changed in India.
Talking about policies, at your time, particularly during the UPA 1 and UPA 2, there has been a criticism that the inflation was high, but the growth was also high. At this point of time, the argument of the government was that we have kept the inflation low. Now you have the inflation again hitting almost the 10-digit mark, double-digit mark. Do you think this government has failed in tackling economic situation?
Well, I mean, the book is not about the current economic situation, but since you mentioned the UPA, I would say that if you look at that 10-year period of the UPA, the first 7 of those years reflect an outstanding economic performance. The growth rate of the economy was 8.4%, which is faster than it has ever been before, or faster than it has been since. And it wasn't just that the growth was fast, it was also very inclusive. Agriculture in that period grew very rapidly, much better than earlier and much better than now. And all of this, there was a boom in investment, tremendous construction of infrastructure, which created a lot of employment. And these things together led to a significant drop in the percentage of the population below the poverty line. Now, even earlier with growth, the population below the percentage of the population below the poverty line had fallen. But this was the first time that the absolute number actually fell. Because earlier, the population percentage declined, but because the total population increased, the number of absolute poor actually increased. This was not so between 2004 and 2011. Where for the first time, we had a reduction of 138 million people below the poverty line. And I think there were many other things that happened in that period which set the foundation for subsequent growth of the economy. The expansion of telecommunication, the expansion of financial access, the creation of Aadhaar, which is a huge enabler to allow digitalization of the economy, all of these things.
Mr. Ahluwalia, you're talking about BPL. There was a infamous affidavit, if I may say it, put it that way, that created quite a political stir. Mrs. Gandhi wasn't quite happy about that. About 32 rupees in urban areas, and there's another mark for the rural areas. How do you reflect upon those times about that affidavit concerned?
Well, the poverty line has been part of our system for quite some time. As a matter of fact, the original poverty line was established in 1993 by the Lakrawala Committee, and it had not been revised at all. Previous government had not revised it. The UPA government set up an expert committee under Suresh Tendulkar to take a fresh look at the poverty line to see if some revisions were needed. And Tendulkar proposed a new poverty line, which was accepted. And so what I'm saying about the drop in poverty relates to the new poverty line. I think at that time, somehow there was an unwillingness on the part of the political class, not just in the Congress party, but across the board, didn't want to accept the fact that poverty had fallen. I mean, maybe some of them thought that this looks as if we are understating the importance of poverty. That's not true, because I had said myself that, look, all we're saying is that the poverty has fallen. We're not saying that poverty has disappeared. I mean, there were still quite high percentages of the population below the poverty line, over 20%. And that's a very large number. But there's no doubt that given a fixed poverty line, the percentage and the absolute number below that line had fallen. And I think this, another reason perhaps why the poverty line became a little controversial was the fear that by saying people have gone above the poverty line, we may be taking away from them some of the benefits that were meant for the poor, like, for example, subsidized food grains. But we made it clear that that is not the case. The entitlement to whether you get subsidized food or not was for a certain percentage of the population, not because you were above or below the poverty line. So I think that was a mistaken fear.
So that fear
led to some problems.
So that fear, what I gather from your understanding is that was a political restlessness. So talking about political restlessness, I mean, was there a kind of pressure, because people said that the actual government was run by NAC? What kind of a role the NAC played? Were you ever did you ever feel intimidated by the role of the NAC?
No, I don't think so. I mean, look, I think the NAC was set up by the UPA recognizing that civil society has become an important voice that we should be listening to. And the NAC had many very distinguished members from the civil society. I don't think they were running the government, but I think they were an active voice on some of the things that civil society is most concerned about. I mean, look at poverty. The Congress manifesto had said that we are going to bring in a food security law. Right. So that was not something that was done by the NAC. Many people in the NAC had a particular view on what kind of food security law we should have. We discussed the matter. They submitted a report which was sent through Mrs. Gandhi to the Prime Minister. I had briefed the NAC even earlier that too wide a degree of eligibility would not be feasible. The matter was examined, the proposals they made were modified, and what finally went through was not what came from the NAC. It was a food security law. And quite frankly, my feeling even then was that we should have done less, because I didn't think that 2/3 of the population needed to be subsidized by a certain amount. I mean, I would have preferred a smaller coverage, but maybe with a bigger entitlement.
I want to hold you there, sir, because you here on book page number 259 on your book, there's a portion called the boom bust phenomena, where you criticize the way food grains were held back, and there were ample opportunities to lower the inflation, but that call wasn't taken by the government at political level. Do you think that call should have been taken?
Well, actually, this is a continuing problem. I mean, I felt that the way the food security operation worked, we bought up grain and built up excess stocks, and we were not in a position to offload those stocks at low prices. That position has actually worsened. I mean, if you look at the current economic survey, they make the same point. They make the point that the stocks are far too high. They're higher than they were at the time of the UPA. And I felt that those high stocks were not economically justified. So quite frankly, the entire system of food procurement, building up food stocks, etc., belongs to a period when there was serious food insecurity and there was doubt about whether we could produce enough food grain to feed the population. That is no longer true. So I think we need a change.
Right. Since you talked about this, the food grain held back is higher here in NDA than it was in UPA. Do you think this tilt of the Modi government towards the left, probably if that is not the way to put it, at least this predicated on welfare economics, do you think that is what better economic?
Well, let me say, I don't want to get into current controversies, but to say that welfare, I mean, even the UPA was very concerned about welfare. I don't believe there's ever been a political party of significance which has said that welfare is not important. I don't think that anybody believes that we have to run a system in which the government should have no concern for the welfare. But the question really is, how much do you do, where do you do it, and what's the best way of doing it? I think, frankly, we need to review many of the schemes that we have put in place, which are supposed to be to help the poor, but which don't actually have the effect that they should be having.
For instance?
Well, I would say that today, to say that in India, 2/3 of the population should be covered, but by providing maybe half of their food grain needs every month, or less than half, at less than 10% of the market price, or open market, just doesn't make any sense. I mean, we had suggested in many documents that, other countries have moved to a cash transfer system. You identify the poor, you give them some cash, and then that will help them to buy whatever they need. I mean, for example, today we are massively subsidizing food grain, but we're not subsidizing milk or vegetables. So we are distorting the pattern of consumption. It's much better to put in place a cash transfer system for the poor and then let them use it for what they want.
So I want to go back to UPA 2 because that is when NAC once again, there's a belief, and that belief many would say is legitimate enough, that there was a troika, that is Manmohan Singh, Rahul Gandhi and Sonia Gandhi. They are the one who are the real power center, and otherwise everybody was just players in it. Do you tend to believe that?
Well, I was working within the government, and within the government the procedures were interministerial consultation and cabinet approval. You're talking about how the political system worked. Now, in any democracy, a political system has multiple power centers, and it's the job of political parties to balance these things off. In a coalition government, these power centers, not just those inside the party, there are power centers outside the party. So I don't think that if you believe in democracy, there's no harm in having different people having different influences. Some care more about some things, some care more about other things. I mean, as long as the system works so that different points of view are being listened to and a balanced view taken, there's nothing wrong with it.
You headed the planning commission, and I remember it was quite a run. What is the difference between planning commission and Niti Aayog? Is there any?
Well, I don't know, because I have no idea what role the Niti Aayog is playing right now. But even when we were in the Planning Commission, Dr. Manmohan Singh had asked us that we should keep taking a look at whether the Planning Commission should be doing different things and giving up some of the old-fashioned planning approaches and responding to the new challenges. And I think we were doing that. We were not doing old-fashioned Soviet-style planning. I mean, some of the people who criticize planning seem to have a completely unrealistic assessment or unreal assessment of what the Planning Commission did. I mean, basically, we were very much involved in determining the total size of the development effort. And sort of this was decided between the Planning Commission on the one hand and the Finance Ministry on the other. Typically, the Finance Ministry would be concerned not to spend too much money. The Planning Commission would say, well, we need to give a development thrust. And these are two different points of view which should be articulated. And the Prime Minister would look at them both and take a final view. And once he took the view, we got down to business. Now, once the budget of the development side of the budget, the planned budget was decided, the Planning Commission was very much involved in determining which ministries' programs should get more money and which should get less. Now, that's a role that has to be played. I'm not sure how it is played today. Probably it's done in the Finance Ministry. But the key issue is these are roles that need to be played. And during the time I was in government, the Planning Commission had a big say in doing that. So that's not the only thing, by the way. I think one of the most important, in fact, my feeling then was and still is, we spend too much time focusing on the amount of money we spend. Because, programs are one part of development, policies are the other. And I felt, and I said on many occasions, that the Planning Commission should take a much more active role in evolving the right policies, which will actually help the country, help the economy to move in the right direction. Now, I don't know whether the Niti Aayog is doing that. If it is, good luck. But it needs to be done. We should constantly question the policies that are in place, because frankly, most of the time, policies have continued because they were there. And it's not a bad idea every 5 years to take a look and ask yourself, does this policy still make sense? And for example, in our time, we were very concerned that energy pricing should be reformed. We are heavily dependent on imported energy. It makes no sense to have domestic energy prices which are not in line with world prices. Now, this was not an easy thing to get done. We did make some progress, but in our time, world prices had shot up. World prices of oil had shot up. Right. In 2014, the world price of oil collapsed, and it became relatively easy to implement a system where the domestic price of oil was more or less aligned with global prices. That sort of examination of underlying policies should be high on the agenda at any given time.
Mr. Ahluwalia, the icing on the cake, probably if I may put it that way, of your book is that one incident that you have referred to about tearing of an ordinance that happened in Press Club was after effects were felt right up to the Washington DC. Then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, Dr. Manmohan Singh was traveling. You say that he sought your opinion whether he should resign. You said that he should not.
No, I think, this is a very small incident, but I'm afraid it's being played up far too much in the newspapers. He didn't seek my opinion on the subject. As it happened, my brother, who's a retired IAS officer, had written an article saying that the Vice President of the Congress Party, Mr. Rahul Gandhi, had made very critical remarks about the ordinance, and that really the Prime Minister should resign. And it's a good thing if we bring in Mr. Rahul Gandhi to run the show. Everybody knows that he's the natural successor within the Congress Party, etc., etc. Now, when I saw that, and he sent it to me by email saying, look, I've published this article and I hope it's not embarrassing. So I wanted to make sure that the Prime Minister heard from me first. So I took it to him in his hotel suite and I said, look, this article has just been published by my brother, and I just want you to know from me rather than hearing it from somebody else. So he read the article in which Sanjeev had said, this is the time for the Prime Minister to resign. And he turned to me and said, do you think I should resign? And I said no. And I had good reasons for that, and I explained that in the book. But it's not as if he was thinking about it and he consulted me. He simply asked me whether I agreed with my brother, because I had drawn his attention to what my brother had said.
But then, sir, there has been multiple incidents where he has, in interviews, Dr. Singh has said that he actually thought of, putting his papers on after that incident. Do you think he should have?
No, I don't, and that's what I told him. We should separate these two separate things here. One is the substance of what Mr. Gandhi said. That is that this ordinance protects politicians who have been convicted, and that is not the right thing to do.
The other was part of the coalition.
Yes, and it was widely felt that he would be a beneficiary if the ordinance came through. I think on the substance of what Mr. Gandhi said, not only was he right, but I think most people actually agreed with him, that the ordinance would be seen as trying to get around this problem. Now, I don't understand why the Prime Minister, when a very important member of his party expresses an opinion, what the Prime Minister said is that the Vice President has written to me and we will discuss this when I get home. That, to my mind, is a perfectly reasonable answer. I don't think that the fact that Mr. Gandhi raised this issue should be a reason to resign. Because I don't think that Dr. Manmohan Singh, on principle, would say that I think it's very important that we have an ordinance that helps leaders who've been convicted. I mean, that was part of the political process. It came up. They didn't actually have the ordinance, but from what I gather, there was a decision that they would have an ordinance. Mr. Gandhi expressed a different view, and the Prime Minister said, we'll give it a rethink. Now, the second issue is whether Mr. Gandhi should have raised this issue at all. I mean, a lot of people felt that, you can't disagree with the Prime Minister. If he had been a member of the cabinet, then I agree that if you're a member of the cabinet that has approved the ordinance, then you shouldn't be, you should just resign. Right. But he was not a member of the cabinet, and he said later on that I have a view, many people in the party agree with me, and there's nothing wrong with my expressing this view. I think the Prime Minister, quite rightly in my view, said we'll discuss it. There's no point in reacting in pique, as if how dare anyone say this thing. So I felt that whole, the fuss that was made about it was made by deliberately trying to make this into a controversial issue. Now, I don't think it was.
I'll quickly go back to that year, that day, and that very moment itself, because that was a press conference at Press Club that was being held by a very senior Congress leader, and he was arguing for the ordinance. And that very moment, Mr. Rahul Gandhi turns up unannounced, and he projects a different belief, a different view that is divergent from his own view, which changes immediately after expressing that view. And what I'm given to understand is that Mr. Gandhi didn't have a consultation or telephonic conversation with the then Prime Minister Dr. Singh before doing so. So don't you think that's the way, very abrupt and brazen way to undermine the stature of a Prime Minister who is seen as a clean man, who is seen as a very upright person?
To be, I mean, you can always try to make it look as if it was a controversial issue, but I think you must recognize that in a democracy, there's nothing wrong with having dissent within the party. I don't think there's much merit in running a party in a way in which everyone in the party simply endorses what the top of the party thinks. So this is an example of democratic dissent surfacing. In my view, nothing wrong with it. Mr. Gandhi himself, I think, said that maybe the words he used were not very appropriate. Because I think at one say he said it's complete nonsense. Okay, yeah. Strong words. But the bottom line, had he simply gone and said that this has happened, and I frankly have grave doubts about the merits of this thing, I don't think there would have been anything wrong with it. I mean, that's what democracy is about. People should freely express their views, and if you disagree with them, you should discuss that. And that's what they did.
Let's jump to 2020. Do you think that democratic dissent, that political dissent is absent in a Modi cabinet?
Well, I mean, that going beyond my book, because I've not made an analysis of what's going on within the cabinet. I have no idea. But I do feel that in a sort of multi-identity, complex country, expression of dissent is an essential part of democracy. To my knowledge, everybody recognizes this. And if that's not happening, then I think we should worry.
And is that happening or is that not happening right now?
Well, there are many protests going on right now on the streets, and I frequently hear sort of occasions when dissent is equated with disloyalty. I think that's completely wrong. People should be... Peaceful dissent is an essential part of the democratic process. And if people feel that that's not happening, then I think the government should reassure them that they are under a misapprehension and live up to those standards.
Final question, sir. Not every day we get a hold of Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwali, one of the foremost economists of this country. There's a massive economic slowdown that we are going through. There have been job losses. There have been, GDP projection have gone down. The fiscal deficit targets have been surpassed. What is your one-point suggestion to Mr. Narendra Modi and Nirmala Sitharaman?
No, I'm not in a position to give one-point suggestions, but I share your view that we should start by recognizing that we have a serious problem. I'm not entirely sure that this is now recognized. I mean, for example, the finance minister has talked about the $5 trillion economy by the year 2024. Now, you know, it's a wonderful target, and when it was first announced, it required a real GDP growth of, let's say, close to 9%. Okay? That's not so different from targets that we have set before, but calling it a $5 trillion economy gave it a new dimension. Now, the question is that we are repeating that target, but the fact is that to achieve that target, you needed about close to 9% growth for about 6 years, beginning in the year 2019-20. On present prospects, we're going to end the year 2019-20 with a growth rate below 5%. Absolutely. There's a lot of discussion that maybe the economy has bottomed out. Finance Minister has said that she sees some green shoots. You know, I'm quite prepared to accept that at 4.5%, which is the last quarterly result that we had, that the economy has bottomed out. It's not going to go below 4.5. But you know, I think the recovery, there's no evidence of a strong recovery, and a normal cyclical phenomenon would produce a little bit of a recovery. So let's say next year, which is the second of the 6 years, the economy will grow more than 5%. That's optimistic, but let's assume that that happens. Now, you know, in the remaining 4 years, can the economy grow fast enough to average 9% over this period, which is necessary in order to reach the 5 trillion target? My view, no. So I think we should recognize that we are off target. We're not growing at the rate we wanted. Similarly, a target has been specified that we're going to double farmer income, you know, by 2022.
Right.
Now, to double farmer income, you need a much, much faster growth in agriculture. And also, you need to take people off agriculture so that there are fewer farmers farming the available land. All the evidence we have suggests that agricultural growth is not as fast as it needs to be. And secondly, we're not creating jobs outside agriculture for people to move out. So even that target is not going to be met. No country has grown rapidly without a much more strong growth in exports. Now, the export performance is actually pathetic. I mean, for the last 6 years, exports in dollar terms have been more or less stagnant, flat. I regard these as very serious problems, and what I think we need to do is to, first of all, acknowledge that there are these problems, and then identify what is it that's going to correct all this. I haven't seen such an analysis of policy, and until we have that, one has to say that we are not on track for getting out of what looks like a pretty serious slowdown at the moment.
Very final question through IANS. If Mr. Narendra Modi is willing to listen to your wisdom and listen to your knowledge, will you be okay to share your views?
I'm not sharing any views on what. It's very difficult to judge what governments should do. When you're not inside, you don't know what everything that's happening. But what I am saying is that the government should start a process, and I'm sure they have lots of advice, internal also. But you have to listen to the right advice and then implement it. So I don't think there's any dearth of knowledge about what needs to be done.
It's just the political decision making that is hampering the process.
Well, that's not for me to say, but I think one can easily lay down the kinds of things that need to be done. You just need to go beyond making the declaration of intent to outlining what specifically you intend to do. And sometimes, when you say you're going to do something in order to achieve an objective, that may not necessarily be the best way of achieving that objective. It may have other consequences. So really, you need a debate on what the government intends to do.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.